Let's bring in Peter Dickinson. He's an editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert Service. He joins me live from Kyiv. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. See, let me ask you this. What is different this time around? Because the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing come from European leaders and the Ukrainian president is something that we have seen in the past, not once, but many times. In the past, European leaders have told the world that, yes, Russia is bad, Putin is bad, and they have tried this before. But when it comes to changing the reality on the ground, nothing is changing. So what do you think is different this time around, and why they're adopting the same strategy that they adopted in the past?
Well, the Russian strategy at the moment is essentially one of trying to outlast the West. Putin is convinced that if he waits long enough, if he invests enough in terms of money, in terms of men, in terms of resources, eventually the West will lose interest in this war, and then he'll be able to break down Ukraine, which will be isolated and ultimately will not be able to withstand Russia's overwhelming advantages in its size. So Putin thinks time is on his side, and that's one of the main reasons why he keeps going, because he believes he just needs to outlast and outweigh the West. So a lot of the objective of these kinds of meetings like today is to send a message to Moscow saying, we are not changing our position. We do remain committed. So yeah, I agree entirely that it's very familiar rhetoric. We've heard it all before, but that's deliberate. I mean, they're saying it again and again to underline the point for the Russians that the West is not growing tired. The West's position is not changing, and they will stay there. If we're talking about real concrete moves, I think clearly that the decision by the Trump administration to impose sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies is far more important for the war than anything that's come out of the meetings this week in Brussels and then today in London. But the Western leaders, the European leaders, are very eager to show to Russia they're not going away anytime soon.
Peter, this has been going on for many years now, and of course, no one really knows when all of this is going to come to an end. But I think one thing that everyone struggles with is understanding or perhaps reading what is on President Putin's mind. At times, he's very open to ending the war, even meeting U.S. President Donald Trump in Alaska. And over there, we saw some significant development. But here we are today. It almost seems like it's a vicious cycle. There is some progress, and then you go back to where you started from. So the question is, what is on President Putin's mind right now?
Well, I think if we look beyond the headlines of what Russia actually says and what Putin said in Alaska, for that matter, when he met with Trump, there's really been no progress. The Russians are, Putin in particular, is very skilled at creating the impression that he wants to make peace. But when you look beyond that at what he himself and what his colleagues say, essentially their idea of peace remains Ukraine's capitulation. They call on Ukraine to hand over around 20% of the country, 25% of the country perhaps in total. They call on Ukraine to be disarmed, for Ukraine's domestic politics to be governed essentially by Russia. So the vision that Putin has of peace is really victory, essentially. He's essentially saying he will fight on until he gets what he wants. And what he wants is an end of Ukraine as a sovereign independent state. Ukraine could exist in some form similar to the current status of Belarus, for example, where they are nominally independent but completely dependent in reality, in all practical terms, on Russia. That's the vision that Putin has for Ukraine, and he's prepared to fight on until he achieves that goal, unless Ukraine and its Western supporters can change the calculus in Moscow by creating more pressure on Russia, both militarily and economically. At the moment, Putin is prepared to continue, and he will not allow any settlement which would guarantee the survival as Ukraine as an independent state. Because in Russia, that would be viewed as a very, very, an historic defeat. And that would put huge pressure on the Putin regime, the survival of the regime, in fact. So Putin can't allow that. He must fight on. His goals are quite clear, I think. And any suggestion that he wants peace or he's ready to negotiate is really essentially a stalling tactic.
That's Peter Dickinson. Peter, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating insights.